Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island, a rare sequel from an author not known for them, and in this case, to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, his most famous work. If you enjoyed this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. And don't forget to join us over on Twitch for our readings Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays at 6 p.m. Pacific. And now, on to the story. Chapter 11. Half an hour later, Cyrus Harding and Herbert had returned to the encampment. The engineer merely told his companions that the land upon which fate had thrown them was an island, and that the next day they would consult. Then each settled himself as well as he could to sleep, and in that rocky hole, at a height of 2,500 feet above the level of the sea, through a peaceful night, the islanders enjoyed a profound repose. The next day, the 30th of March, after a hasty breakfast, which consisted solely of the roasted tragopan, the engineer wished to climb again to the summit of the volcano so as to more attentively survey the island upon which he and his companions were imprisoned for life, perhaps, should the island be situated at a great distance from any land of which it was out of the course of vessels which visited the archipelagos of the Pacific Ocean. This time his companions followed him in the new exploration. They also wished to see the island, on the productions of which they must depend for the supply of all their wants. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning when Cyrus Harding, Herbert Pencroft, Gideon Spilett, and Neb quitted the encampment. No one appeared to be anxious about their situation. They had faith in themselves, doubtless, but it must be observed that the basis of this faith was not the same with Harding as with his companions. The engineer had confidence because he felt capable of extorting from this wild country everything necessary for the life of himself and his companions. The latter feared nothing just because Cyrus Harding was with them. Pencroft, especially, since the incident of the relighted fire, would not have despaired for an instant, even if it was on a bare rock, if the engineer was with him on the rock. "Pshaw," said he. "We left Richmond without permission from the authorities. It'll be hard if we don't manage to get away some day or other from a place where certainly no one will detain us." Cyrus Harding followed the same road as the evening before. They went round the cone by the plateau which formed the shoulder, to the mouth of the enormous chasm. The weather was magnificent. The sun rose in a pure sky and flooded with his rays all the eastern side of the mountain. The crater was reached. It was just what the engineer had made it out to be in the dark, that is to say, a vast funnel which extended, widening, to a height of 1,000 feet above the plateau. Below the chasm, large, thick streaks of lava wound over the sides of the mountain, and thus marked the course of the eruptive matter to the lower valleys, which furrowed the northern part of the island. The interior of the crater, whose inclinations did not exceed 35 to 40 degrees, presented no difficulties nor obstacles to the ascent. Traces of very ancient lava were noticed, which probably had overflowed the summit of the cone before this lateral chasm had opened a new way to it. As to the volcanic chimney which established a communication between the subterranean layers in the crater, its depth could not be calculated with the eye, for it was lost in obscurity, but there was no doubt as to the complete extinction of the volcano. Before 8 o'clock, Harding and his companions were assembled at the summit of the crater, on a conical mound which swelled the northern edge. The sea everywhere," they cried, as if their lips could not restrain the words which made islanders of them. The sea, indeed, formed an immense circular sheet of water all around them. Perhaps, on climbing again to the summit of the cone, Cyrus Harding had had a hope of discovering some coast, some island shore which he had not been able to perceive in the dark the evening before. But nothing appeared on the farthest verge of the horizon, that is to say, over a radius of more than 50 miles. No land in sight, not a sail, Over all this immense space, the ocean alone was visible. The island occupied the center of a circumference which appeared to be infinite. The engineer and his companions, mute and motionless, surveyed for some minutes every point of the ocean, examining it to its utmost extreme limits. Even Pencroft, who possessed a marvelous power of sight, saw nothing, and certainly if there had been land at the horizon, if it had appeared only as an indistinct vapor, the sailor would undoubtedly have found it out, for nature had placed regular telescopes under his eyebrows. From the ocean, their gaze returned to the island which they commanded entirely, and the first question was put by Gideon Spilett in these terms. "About what size is this island?" Truly, it did not appear large in the midst of the immense ocean. Cyrus Harding reflected a few minutes. He attentively observed the perimeter of the island, taking into consideration the height at which he was placed, and then, "My friends," said he, "I do not think I am mistaken in giving to the shore of the island a circumference of more than 100 miles. And consequently an area?" "That is difficult to estimate," replied the engineer, "for it is so uneven." If Cyrus Harding was not mistaken in his calculation, the island had almost the extent of Malta or Zante in the Mediterranean, but it was at the same time much more irregular and less rich in capes, promontories, points, bays, or creeks. Its strange form caught the eye, and when Gideon Spilett, on the engineer's advice, had drawn the outline, they found that it resembled some fantastic animal, a monstrous leviathan which lay sleeping on the surface of the Pacific. This was, in fact, the exact shape of the island, which it is of consequence to know, and a tolerably correct map of it was immediately drawn by the reporter. The east part of the shore, where the castaways had landed, formed a wide bay terminated by a sharp cape, which had been concealed by a high point from Pencroft on his first exploration. At the northeast, two other capes closed the bay, and between them ran a narrow gulf which looked like the half-open jaws of a formidable dogfish. From the northeast to the southwest, the coast was rounded, like the flattened cranium of an animal, rising again, forming a sort of protuberance which did not give any particular shape to this part of the island, of which the center was occupied by the volcano. From this point the shore ran pretty regularly north and south, broken at 2/3 of its perimeter by a narrow creek, from which it ended in a long tail, similar to the caudal appendage of a gigantic alligator. This tail formed a regular peninsula, which stretched more than 30 miles into the sea, reckoning from the cape southeast of the island already mentioned. It curled round, making an open roadstead which marked out the lower shore of this strangely formed land. At the narrowest part, that is to say between the Chimneys and the creek on the western shore, which corresponded to it in latitude, the island only measured 10 miles, but its greatest length from the jaws of the northeast to the extremity of the tail of the southwest was not less than 30 miles. As to the interior of the island, its general aspect was this: very woody throughout the southern part from the mountain to the shore, and arid and sandy in the northern part. Between the volcano and the east coast, Cyrus Harding and his companions were surprised to see a lake bordered with green trees, the existence of which they had not suspected. Seen from this height, the lake appeared to be on the same level as the ocean, but on reflection the engineer explained to his companions that the altitude of this little sheet of water must be about 300 feet, because the plateau, which was its basin, was but a prolongation of the coast. "Is it a freshwater lake?" asked Pencroft. "Certainly," replied the engineer, "for it must be fed by the water which flows from the mountain." "I see a little river which runs into it," said Herbert, pointing out a narrow stream, which evidently took its source somewhere in the west. "Yes," said Harding, "and since this stream feeds the lake, most probably on the side near the sea, there is an outlet by which the surplus water escapes. We shall see that on our return." This little winding watercourse in the river already mentioned constituted the water system, at least such as it was displayed to the eyes of the explorer. However, it was possible that under the masses of trees which covered 2/3 of the island, forming an immense forest, other rivers ran toward the sea. It might even be inferred that such was the case, so rich did this region appear the most magnificent specimens of the flora of the temperate zones. There was no indication of running water in the north, though perhaps there might be stagnant water among the marshes in the northeast. But that was all, in addition to the downs, sand, and aridity which contrasted so strongly with the luxuriant vegetation. But that was all, in addition to the downs, sand, and aridity which contrasted so strongly with the luxuriant vegetation of the rest of the island. The volcano did not occupy the central part. It rose, on the contrary, in the northwestern region and seemed to mark the boundary of the two zones. At the southwest, at the south, and the southeast, the first part of the spurs were hidden under masses of verdure. At the north, on the contrary, one could follow the ramifications, which died away on the sandy plains. It was on this side that, at the time when the mountain was in a state of eruption, the discharge had worn away a passage, and a large heap of lava had spread to the narrow jaw which formed the northeastern gulf. Cyrus Harding and his companions remained an hour at the top of the mountain. The island was displayed under their eyes like a plan in relief with different tints. Green for the forests, yellow for the sand, blue for the water. They viewed it in its tout ensemble. Nothing remained concealed but the ground hidden by verdure, the hollows of the valleys, and the interior of the volcanic chasms. One important question remained to be solved, and the answer would have a great effect upon the future of the castaways. Was the island inhabited? It was the reporter who put this question, to which, after the close examination they had just made, the answer seemed to be in the negative. Nowhere could the work of a human hand be perceived. Not a group of huts, not a solitary cabin, not a fishery on the shore. No smoke curling in the air betrayed the presence of man. It is true, a distance of nearly 30 miles separated the observers from the extreme points, that is, of the tail which extended to the southwest, and it would have been difficult even to Pencroft's eyes to discover a habitation there. Neither could the curtain of verdure which covered 3/4 of the island be raised to see if it did not shelter some straggling village. But in general, the islanders live on the shores of the narrow spaces which emerge above the waters of the Pacific, and this shore appeared to be an absolute desert. Until a more complete exploration, it might be admitted that the island was uninhabited. But was it frequented, at least occasionally, by the natives of neighboring islands? It was difficult to reply to this question. No land appeared within a radius of 50 miles, but 50 miles could be easily crossed either by Malay proas or by the large Polynesian canoes. Everything depended on the position of the island, of its isolation in the Pacific, or of its proximity to archipelagos. Would Cyrus Harding be able to find out their latitude and longitude without instruments? It would be difficult. Since he was in doubt, it was best to take precautions against a possible descent of neighboring natives. The exploration of the island was finished, its shape determined, its features made out, its extent calculated, the water and mountain systems ascertained. The disposition of the forests and plains had been marked in a general way on the reporter's plan. They had now only to descend the mountain slopes again and explore the soil, in the triple point of view of its mineral, vegetable, and animal resources. But before giving his companions a signal for departure, Cyrus Harding said to them in a calm, grave voice, "Here, my friends, is the small corner of land upon which the hand of the Almighty has thrown us. We are going to live here a long time, perhaps. Perhaps, too, unexpected help will arrive if some ship passes by chance. I say by chance because this is an unimportant island. There is not even a port at which ships could anchor, and it is to be feared that it is situated out of the route usually followed. That is to say, too much to the south for the ships which frequent the archipelagos of the Pacific, and too much to the north for those which go to Australia by doubling Cape Horn. I wish to hide nothing of our position from you." "And you're right, my dear Cyrus," replied the reporter with animation. "You have to deal with men. They have confidence in you, and you can depend upon them. Is it not so, my friends?" "I will obey you in everything, Captain," said Herbert, seizing the engineer's hand. "My master always, And everywhere, cried Neb. As for me, said the sailor, if I ever grumble at work, my name's not Jack Pencroft, and if you like, Captain, we'll make a little America of this island. We'll build towns, we'll establish railways, start telegraphs. One fine day, when it's quite changed, quite put in order and quite civilized, we will go and offer it to the government of the Union. We will build towns, we'll establish railways, start telegraphs, and one fine day, when it's quite changed, quite put in order and quite civilized, we will go and offer it to the government of the Union. Only I ask one thing. What is that? Said the reporter. It is that we do not consider ourselves castaways, but colonists who have come here to settle. Harding could not help smiling, and the sailor's idea was adopted. He then thanked his companions and added that he would rely on their energy and on the aid of heaven. Well, now, let us set off to the chimneys, cried Pencroft. 1 minute, my friends, said the engineer. It seems to me it would be a good thing to give a name to this island, as well as to the capes, promontories, and watercourses which we can see. Very good, said the reporter. In the future, that will simplify the instructions which we shall have to give and follow. Indeed, said the sailor. Already it's something to be able to say where one is going and where one has come from. At least it looks like somewhere. The chimneys, for example, said Herbert. Exactly, replied Pencroft. That name was the most convenient, and it came to me quite of myself. Shall we keep the name of the chimneys for our first encampment, Captain? Yes, Pencroft, since you so christened it. Good. As to the others, that'll be easy, returned the sailor, who was in high spirits. Let us give them names, as the Robinsons did, whose story Herbert has often read to me. Providence Bay, Whale Point, Cape Disappointment. Or rather the names of Captain Harding, said Herbert, of Mr. Spilett, of Neb. My name, cried Neb, showing his sparkling white teeth. Why not, replied Pencroft. Port Neb. That would do very well. And Cape Gideon. I should prefer borrowing names from our country, said the reporter, which would remind us of America. Yes, for the principal ones, then said Cyrus Harding. For those of the bays and seas, I admit it willingly. We might give to that vast bay on the east the name of Union Bay, for example, to that large hollow in the south, Washington Bay, to the mountain upon which we are standing, that of Mount Franklin, to that lake which is extended under our eyes, that of Lake Grant. Nothing could be better, my friends. These names will recall our country, and those of the great citizens who have honored it. But for the rivers, gulfs, capes, and promontories, which we perceive from the top of the mountain, rather let us choose names which will recall their particular shape. They will impress themselves better on our memory, and at the same time will be more practical. The shape of the island is so strange that we shall not be troubled to imagine what it resembles. As to the streams which we do not know as yet in different parts of the forest which we shall explore later, the creeks which afterwards will be discovered, we can christen them as we find them. What do you think, my friends? The engineer's proposal was unanimously agreed to by his companions. The island was spread out under their eyes like a map, and they had only to give names to all its angles and points. Gideon Spilett would write them down, and the geographical nomenclature of the island would be definitely adopted. First, they named the two bays on the mountain, Union Bay, Washington Bay, Mount Franklin, as the engineer had suggested. Now, said the reporter, to this peninsula of the southwest of the island, I propose to give the name of Serpentine Peninsula, and that of the reptile end of the bent tail which terminates it, for it is just like a reptile's tail. Adopted, said the engineer. Now, said Herbert, pointing to the other extremity of the island, let us call this gulf, which is so singular like a pair of open jaws, Shark Gulf. Capital, cried Pencroft, and we can complete the resemblance by naming the two parts of the jaws Mandible Cape. But there are two capes, observed the reporter. Well, replied Pencroft, we can have North Mandible Cape and South Mandible Cape. They're inscribed, said Spilett. There's only one point of the southeastern extremity of the island to be named, said Pencroft. That is the extremity of Union Bay? Asked Herbert. Claw Cape, cried Neb directly, who also wished to be godfather to some part of his domain. In truth, Neb had found an excellent name, for this cape was very like the powerful claw of the fantastic animal which this singularly shaped island represented. Pencroft was delighted at the turn things had taken, and their imaginations soon gave to the river which furnished the settlers with drinking water, and near which the balloon had thrown them, the name of the Mercy, in true gratitude to Providence. To the islet upon which the castaways had first landed, the name of Safety Island. To the plateau which crowned the high granite precipice above the Chimneys, and from whence the gaze could embrace the whole of the vast bay, the name of Prospect Heights. Lastly, all the masses of impenetrable wood which covered the Serpentine Peninsula were named the Forests of the Far West. The nomenclature of the visible and known parts of the island was thus finished, and later they would complete it as they made fresh discoveries. As to the points of the compass, the engineer had roughly fixed them by the height and position of the sun, which placed Union Bay and Prospect Heights to the east. But the next day, by taking the exact hour of the rising and setting of the sun, and by marking its position between this rising and setting, he reckoned to fix the north of the island exactly. For in consequence of its situation in the southern hemisphere, the sun, at the precise moment of its culmination, passed in the north and not in the south, as in its apparent movement it seems to do to those places situated in the northern hemisphere. Everything was finished, and the settlers had only to descend Mount Franklin to return to the Chimneys, when Pencroft cried out, "Well, we're preciously stupid." "Why?" asked Gideon Spilett, who had closed his notebook and risen to depart. "Why, our island. We've forgotten to christen it." Herbert was going to propose to give it the engineer's name, and all his companions would have applauded him, when Cyrus Harding said simply, "Let us give it the name of a great citizen, my friend, of him who now struggles to defend the unity of the American Republic. Let us call it Lincoln Island." The engineer's proposal was replied to by 3 hurrahs. And that evening, before sleeping, the new colonists talked of their absent country. They spoke of the terrible war which stained it with blood. They could not doubt that the South would soon be subdued, and that the cause of the North, the cause of justice, would triumph, thanks to Grant, thanks to Lincoln. Now this happened the 30th of March, 1865. They little knew that 16 days afterward a frightful crime would be committed in Washington, and that on Good Friday Abraham Lincoln would fall by the hand of a fanatic. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. They now began the descent of the mountain. Climbing down the crater, they went round the cone and reached their encampment of the previous night. Pencroft thought it must be breakfast time, and the watches of the reporter and the engineer were therefore consulted to find out the hour. That of Gideon Spilett had been preserved from the sea water, as he had been thrown at once on the sand out of reach of the waves. It was an instrument of excellent quality, a perfect pocket chronometer, which the reporter had not forgotten to wind up carefully every day. As to the engineer's watch, it of course had stopped during the time which he had passed on the downs. The engineer now wound it up, and ascertaining by the height of the sun that it must be about 9 o'clock in the morning, he put his watch at that hour. "No, my dear Spilett, wait. You've kept the Richmond time, have you not?" "Yes, Cyrus." "Consequently, your watch is set by the meridian of that town, which is almost that of Washington?" "Undoubtedly." "Very well, keep it thus. Content yourself with winding it up very exactly, but do not touch the hands. This may be of use to us." "What will be the good of that?" thought the sailor. They ate, and so heartily that the store of game and almonds was totally exhausted. But Pencroft was not at all uneasy. They would supply themselves on the way. Top, whose share had been very much to his taste, would know how to find some fresh game among the brushwood. Moreover, the sailor thought of simply asking the engineer to manufacture some powder and 1 or 2 fowling pieces. He supposed there would be no difficulty in that. On leaving the plateau, the captain proposed to his companions to return to the Chimneys by a new way. He wished to reconnoiter Lake Grant, so magnificently framed in trees. They therefore followed the crest of one of the spurs between which the creek that supplied the lake probably had its source. In talking, the settlers already employed the names which they had just chosen, which singularly facilitated the exchange of their ideas. Herbert and Pencroft, the one young and the other very boyish, were enchanted, and while walking the sailor said, "Hey, Herbert, how capital it sounds! It would be impossible to lose ourselves, my boy, since whether we follow the way to Lake Grant or whether we join the Mercy through the woods of the far west, we shall be certain to arrive at Prospect Heights, and consequently at Union Bay." It had been agreed that without forming a compact bond, the settlers should not stray away from each other. It was very certain that the thick forests of the island were inhabited by dangerous animals, and it was prudent to be on their guard. In general, Pencroft, Herbert, and Neb walked first, preceded by Top, who poked his nose into every bush. The reporter and the engineer went together, Gideon Spilett ready to note every incident, the engineer silent for the most part, and only stepping aside to pick up one thing or another, a mineral or vegetable substance, which he put into his pocket without making any remark. "What could he be picking up?" muttered Pencroft. "I've looked in vain for anything that's worth the trouble of stooping for." Towards 10 o'clock the little band descended the last declivities of Mount Franklin. As yet the ground was scantily strewn with bushes and trees. They were walking over yellowish, calcinated earth, forming a plain of nearly a mile long, which extended to the edge of the wood. Great blocks of that basalt which, according to Bischoff, takes 350 millions of years to cool, strewed the plain, very confused in some places. However, there were here no traces of lava, which was spread more particularly over the northern slopes. Cyrus Harding expected to reach without incident the course of a creek, which he supposed flowed under the trees at the border of the plain, when he saw Herbert running hastily back, while Neb and the sailor were hiding behind the rocks. "What's the matter, my boy?" asked Spilett. "Smoke," replied Herbert. "We've seen smoke among the rocks, 100 paces from us." "Men at this place?" cried the reporter. "We must avoid showing ourselves before knowing with whom we have to deal," replied Cyrus Harding. "I trust that there are no natives on this island. I dread them more than anything else. Where's Top?" "Top is on before." "And he doesn't bark?" "No." "That is strange. However, we must try to call him back." In a few minutes the engineer, Gideon Spilett, and Herbert had rejoined their two companions, and like them they kept out of sight behind the heaps of basalt. From thence they clearly saw smoke of a yellowish color rising in the air. Top was recalled by a slight whistle from his master, and the latter, signing to his companions to wait for him, glided away among the rocks. The colonists, motionless, anxiously awaited the result of this exploration, when a shout from the engineer made them hasten forward. They soon joined him, and were at once struck with a disagreeable odor which impregnated the atmosphere. The odor, easily recognized, was enough for the engineer to guess what the smoke was which at first, not without cause, had startled him. "This fire," said he, "or rather this smoke, is produced by nature alone. There's a sulphur spring there which will cure all our sore throats." "Captain," cried Pencroft, "what a pity that I haven't got a cold." The settlers then directed their steps towards the place from which the smoke escaped. There they saw a sulphur spring which flowed abundantly between the rocks, and its waters discharged a strong sulphuric acid odor, after having absorbed the oxygen of the air. Cyrus Harding, dipping in his hand, felt the water oily to the touch. He tasted it and found it rather sweet. As to its temperature, that he estimated at 95 degrees Fahrenheit, Herbert having asked on what he based this calculation. "It's quite simple, my boy," said he, "for in plunging my hand into the water I felt no sensation, either of heat or cold. Therefore it has the same temperature as the human body, which is about 95 degrees. The sulphur spring not being of any actual use to the settlers, they proceeded towards the thick border of the forest, which began some 100 paces off. There, as they had conjectured, the waters of the stream flowed clear and limpid between high banks of red earth, the color of which betrayed the presence of oxide of iron. From this color, the name of Red Creek was immediately given to the watercourse. It was only a large stream, deep and clear, formed of the mountain water, which, half river, half torrent, here rippling peacefully over the sand, there falling against the rocks, or dashing down in a cascade, ran towards the lake over a distance of 1.5 miles, its breadth varying from 30 to 40 feet. Its waters were sweet, and it was supposed that those of the lake were so also, a fortunate circumstance in the event of their finding on its borders a more suitable dwelling than the chimneys. As to the trees, which some 100 feet downward shaded the banks of the creek, they belonged, for the most part, to the species which abound in the temperate zone of America and Tasmania, and no longer to those coniferae observed in that portion of the island already explored to some miles from Prospect Heights. At this time of the year, the commencement of the month of April, which represents the month of October in this hemisphere, that is, the beginning of autumn, they were still in full leaf. They consisted principally of casuarinas and eucalypti, some of which next year would yield a sweet manna similar to the manna of the East. Clumps of Australian cedars rose on the sloping banks, which were also covered with a high grass called tussock in New Holland. But the coconut, so abundant in the archipelagos of the Pacific, seemed to be wanting in the island, the latitude doubtless being too low. "What a pity," said Herbert, "such a useful tree, and which has such beautiful nuts." As to the birds, they swarmed among the scanty branches of the eucalypti and casuarinas, which did not hinder the display of their wings. Black, white, or gray cockatoos, paroquets with plumage of all colors, kingfishers of a sparkling green and crowned with red, blue, lories, and various other birds appeared on all sides as though a prism, fluttering about and producing a deafening clamor. Suddenly a strange concert of discordant voices resounded in the midst of a thicket. The settlers heard successively the song of birds, the cry of quadrupeds, and the sort of clacking which they might have believed to have escaped from the lips of a native. Neb and Herbert rushed towards the bush, forgetting even the most elementary principles of prudence. Happily they found there neither a formidable wild beast nor a dangerous native, but merely a half-dozen mocking and singing birds known as mountain pheasants. A few skillful blows from a stick soon put an end to their concert, and procured excellent food for the evening's dinner. Herbert also discovered some magnificent pigeons with bronzed wings, some superbly crested, others draped in green like their congeners at Port Macquarie, but it was impossible to reach them, or the crows and magpies which flew away in the rocks. A charge of small shot would have made great slaughter among these birds, but the hunters were still limited to sticks and stones, and these primitive weapons proved very insufficient. Their insufficiency was still more clearly shown when a troop of quadrupeds, jumping, bounding, making leaps of 30 feet, regular flying mammiferae, fled over the thickets so quickly and at such a height that one would have thought that they passed from one tree to another like squirrels. "Kangaroos!" cried Herbert. "Are they good to eat?" asked Pencroft. "Stewed," replied the reporter. "Their flesh is equal to the best venison." Gideon Spilett had not finished this exciting sentence when the sailor, followed by Neb and Herbert, darted on the kangaroo's tracks. Cyrus Harding called them back in vain. But it was in vain, too, for the hunters to pursue such agile game, which went bounding away like balls. After a chase of 5 minutes, they lost their breath, and at the same time all sight of the creatures, which disappeared in the wood. Top was not more successful than his masters. "Captain," said Pencroft, when the engineer and the reporter had rejoined them, "Captain, you see quite well we can't get on unless we make a few guns. Will that be possible?" "Perhaps," replied the engineer. "But we will begin by first manufacturing some bows and arrows, and I don't doubt that you will become as clever in the use of them as the Australian hunters." Bows and arrows, said Pencroft scornfully. That's all very well for children. Don't be proud, friend Pencroft, replied the reporter. Bows and arrows were sufficient for centuries to stain the earth with blood. Powder is but a thing of yesterday, and war's as old as the human race, unhappily. Faith, that's true, Mr. Spilett, replied the sailor, and I always speak too quickly. You must excuse me. Meanwhile, Herbert, constant to his favorite science, natural history, reverted to the kangaroos, saying, Besides, we had to deal just now with a species which is most difficult to catch. They were giants with long gray fur, but if I'm not mistaken, there exist black and red kangaroos, rock kangaroos, and rat kangaroos, which are more easy to get hold of. It is reckoned that there are about a dozen species. Herbert, replied the sailor sententiously, there's only one species of kangaroos to me. That is, kangaroo on the spit, and it's just the one we haven't got this evening. They could not help laughing at Master Pencroft's new classification. The honest sailor did not hide his regret at being reduced for dinner to the singing pheasants, but fortune once more showed itself obliging to him. In fact, Top, who felt that his interest was concerned, went and ferreted everywhere with an instinct doubled by a ferocious appetite. It was even probable that if some piece of game did fall into his clutches, none would be left for the hunters, if Top was hunting on his own account. But Neb watched him, and he did well. Towards 3 o'clock, the dog disappeared in the brushwood, and grunting showed that he was engaged in a struggle with some animal. Neb rushed after him, and soon saw Top eagerly devouring a quadruped, which 10 seconds later would have been past recognizing in Top's stomach. But fortunately, the dog had fallen upon a brood, and besides the victim he was devouring, 2 other rodents, the animals in question belonged to that order, lay strangled on the turf. Neb reappeared triumphantly, holding one of the rodents in each hand. Their size exceeded that of a rabbit, their hair was yellow, mingled with green spots, and they had the merest rudiments of tails. The citizens of Union were at no loss for the right name of these rodents. They were maras, a sort of agouti, a little larger than their congeners of tropical countries, regular American rabbits, with long ears, jaws armed on each side with 5 molars, which distinguished the agouti. "Hurrah!" cried Pencroft. "The roast has arrived, and now we can go home." The walk, interrupted for an instant, was resumed. The limpid waters of the Red Creek flowed under an arch of casuarinas, banksias, and gigantic gum trees. Superb lilacs rose to a height of 20 feet. Other arborescent species, unknown to the young naturalist, bent over the stream, which could be heard murmuring between the bowers of verdure. Meanwhile, the stream grew much wider, and Cyrus Harding supposed that they would soon reach its mouth. In fact, on emerging from beneath a thick clump of beautiful trees, it suddenly appeared before their eyes. The explorers had arrived on the western shores of Lake Grant. The place was well worth looking at. This extent of water, of a circumference of nearly 7 miles and an area of 250 acres, reposed in a border of diversified trees. Towards the east, through a curtain of verdure, picturesquely raised in some places, sparkled a horizon of sea. The lake was curved to the north, which contrasted with the sharp outline of its lower part. Numerous aquatic birds frequented the shores of this little Ontario, in which the 1,000 isles of its American namesake were represented by a rock which emerged from its surface. Some 100 feet from the southern shore there lived in harmony several couples of kingfishers, perched on a stone, grave, motionless, watching for fish. Then darting down, they plunged in with a sharp cry and reappeared with their prey in their beaks. On the shores and on the islets strutted wild ducks, pelicans, water hens, red beaks, phyllodons, furnished with a tongue like a brush, and 1 or 2 specimens of the splendid Menura, the tail of which expands gracefully like a lyre. As to the waters of the lake, it was sweet, limpid, rather dark, and from certain bubblings and the concentric circles which crossed each other on the surface, it could not be doubted that it abounded in fish. "This lake is really beautiful," said Gideon Spilett. We could live on its borders. We will thrive here, replied Harding. The settlers, wishing to return to the chimneys by the shortest way, descended towards the angle formed on the south by the junction of the lake's bank. It was not without difficulty that they broke a path through the thickets and brushwood which had never been put aside by the hand of men, and they thus went towards the shore so as to arrive at the north of Prospect Heights. 2 miles were cleared in this direction, and then, after they had passed the last curtain of trees, appeared the plateau, carpeted with thick turf, and beyond that, the infinite sea. To return to the chimneys, it was enough to cross the plateau obliquely for the space of a mile, and then to descend to the elbow formed by the first detour of the Mercy. But the engineer desired to know how and where the overplus of the water from the lake escaped, and the exploration was prolonged under the trees for 1.5 miles towards the north. It was the most probable that an overfall existed somewhere, and doubtless through a cleft in the granite. This lake was only, in short, an immense center basin, which was filled by degrees by the creek, and its waters must necessarily pass to the sea by some fall. If it was so, the engineer thought that it might perhaps be possible to utilize this fall and borrow its power, actually lost without profit to anyone. They continued then to follow the shores of Lake Grant by climbing the plateau, but after having gone 1 mile in this direction, Cyrus Harding had not been able to discover the overfall, which, however, must exist somewhere. It was then 4:30. In order to prepare for dinner, it was necessary that the settlers should return to their dwelling. The little band retraced their steps, therefore, and by the left bank of the Mercy, Cyrus Harding and his companions arrived at the chimneys. The fire was lighted, and Neb and Pencroft, on whom the functions of cooks naturally devolved, to the one in his quality of negro, to the other in that of sailor, quickly prepared some broiled agouti, to which they did great justice. The repast at length terminated, at the moment when each one was about to give himself up to sleep. Cyrus Harding drew from his pocket little specimens of different sorts of minerals, and just said, "My friends, this is iron mineral, this a pyrite, this is clay, this is lime, and this is coal. Nature gives us these things. It is our business to make a right use of them. Tomorrow we will commence operations." End of chapter 12. Well, they're still alive. Let's see what happens next, shall we? If you've enjoyed this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to hit the like and subscribe, smash that bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. Good night now.